Hi everyone, I hope you're doing okay. So throughout the course, I'm going to show a presentation before each major project. And these are meant to give you some inspiration and also to just sort of give you a glimpse into different conceptual ways that you can enter this process. So while the demonstration video and the project itself has you following some specific techniques, I encourage you all to sort of think about how this conceptual idea of patterns in nature speaks to you and how you can then translate that into your work and your project. So let's begin. So the first artwork that I wanted to show you is this image of a mosque in Iran, and I might be butchering the pronunciation, but I believe it's called the Sheikh Lotfallah Mosque. And it's this masterpiece of Iranian architecture that uses incredible use of pattern, of repetition, but also of organic as well as geometric form. And one thing that I found really incredible about this piece of architecture when I read more about it was that each piece of these mosaic tiles were actually partially glazed and partially unglazed. So while the images themselves mimic patterns that are found in nature, the way that light catches on either the shiny or the matte parts of each pattern changes while viewers walk through it. So it actually becomes a living, moving, three-dimensional object, while they're also using surface decoration as a primary mode of making this happen. I think it's just incredible. And throughout Islamic architecture, you can find really incredible examples of patterns in nature. And each one of these patterns are so specific, so detailed, and so various. There's so much diversity in the kinds of shapes you can find in this mosque. Another piece of architecture I wanted to show you was the Hakone Open Air Museum in Hakone, Japan. And I could imagine that walking up this staircase and looking through these patterned, colored stained glass out into the landscape would have a really profound sort of effect on how you're viewing that landscape. And so they're very organically organized, but at the same time, they're using light, pattern, and form throughout each one of these sort of segments of this architecture to create such an interesting and participatory work of art. All right, here's a few works by Annie Albers. Annie Albers was a part of the Bauhaus movement in Germany, who then later became a part of the Black Mountain College here in America, both of which were schools in which artists kind of built their own way of learning. So one thing that I read about the Bauhaus, while it was really incredibly innovative in the art that came out of it and the ideas that they were talking about, was that Annie Albers actually wasn't able to take most classes except for weaving or specific classes that were delegated to women. So she kind of found weaving on accident because she was forced into these courses, which she didn't really, she might have wanted to be painting with the other students and artists, but she took weaving. She took what she was allowed to do, and she made it into this incredible art form. So these really kind of merged these ideas of art and craft. And while she is definitely working with the tradition of weaving, she's also bringing fine art into it. So she used incredibly experimental techniques to create works that were unlike any weavings you might have seen before. All right, these are a few works by Alicia McCarthy, and she was one of my mentors in the graduate program that I went to in San Francisco Art Institute. And along the similar lines of weaving, she uses paint, screen print, oil paint, spray paint, to create almost woven canvases or woven areas of paint and color and line. And the way that she talks about her work is that she feels that these patterns, these woven compositions, are metaphors for community. So they're metaphors for how interconnected we all are and interdependent on one another, um, while also being incredibly imperfect. So she often will leave certain drops of spray paint on certain parts of her canvas, but then other sections will be so detailed and specific. She'll spend so much time getting these colors perfectly in relation to one another and in space, while at the same time embracing the imperfections. So I'm hoping that that's something you guys will bring into this project, is sort of your own way of letting go of the perfection and trying to find your own metaphor in the process of this sort of texture and pattern in nature that we'll be working with. All right, here's an image by Catherine Bertola. And she's an artist who also is using material and pattern as a metaphor. So she actually will make these works out of dust. So this image you see on the left here was made using a stencil and applying dust incredibly carefully to create an ephemeral work of art. It's hard to tell if it's hard to say if this is a painting or a drawing or a sculpture. I think it might be all of them, but this sort of ephemeral work is incredibly interesting because she's using the material of dust in order to talk about sort of the history of sort of women's work. So she's kind of taking that idea and flipping the script and subverting it through, instead of sort of just typical gender roles, why not use dust as an art element in itself? It's really poetic. All right. This is one of my very favorite artists, Ruth Asawa, and she is just an incredible artist who works across all sorts of media, but she's primarily known for her wire sculptures. And she'll normally start these processes of making these sculptures through drawing. I wanted to read this quote from her. "My curiosity was aroused by the idea of giving structural form to the images in my drawings. These forms come from observing plants, the spiral shell of a snail, seeing light through insect wings, watching spiders repair their webs in the early morning, and seeing the sun through the droplets of water suspended from the tips of pine needles while watering my garden." And you can see in just the beautiful, delicate way of drawing that she's really honing in on pattern, but also the nuance and the variety within these forms. And here's a few examples of her larger sculptures. And I really love the idea of sort of membranes, or seeing something through an insect wing. And I feel like these completely capture that feeling of light shining through organic textures and patterns. So she'll embed forms inside of other forms inside of other forms. And while this class is based on 2D design, I more than encourage you guys to pull inspiration from three-dimensional works, from film, from video, from performance art. I think that anything is valid inspiration. So feel free to shoot me an email if you have anything you would like to show the class for a specific theme or project. All right, this is an image from Vic Muniz and Tal Danino's Colonies collaboration. All right, so Vic Muniz is an artist who works in really large scale as well as very small scale, and he uses a wide variety of very unexpected materials. And Tal Danino is a microbiologist at MIT, and the two of them got together and made this collaborative series of works in which the two of them worked together to create art out of living cells and then photograph them to then be displayed in museums at a very large scale. And this specific image I'm showing you is, I believe, from an image of cancer cells. So they'll use a lot of, you know, cells that are infected with viruses or cancer, and they'll then take them and train them to sort of move into these gorgeous patterns. So they're working with the cells themselves, but they're also kind of transforming this idea of something really scary into something beautiful or something timeless. I think it's a really incredible and complex work of art. All right, here's a couple of works by Andrew Goldsworthy. And similar to Catherine Bortola, a lot of his works aren't meant to last very long. So they're what's called ephemeral art. And he'll go out into the field, he'll go out into the forest or the tundra, all sorts of different landscapes, and he'll use whatever he finds there to create work. So a lot of what he's doing is he's really experimenting with whatever he can find, reconfiguring them into different structures, and then really letting the materials speak for themselves, but also completely guide the process. So in these works, he's using ice, and in a film that I highly recommend on YouTube of his work and him talking about his work that I can share with you all, he talks about how the materials themselves kind of guide the entire process. So this work on the right, he's stacking these blocks of ice, and he's not using any kind of interior armature. So there's no interior structure to hold them up, but instead he's relying on the pure balance of the weight, of the physical weight of these objects. And that's something that artists do a lot, is think about how one element is weighing on another. But in this case, he's working with both physical, literal weight and balance, and visual implied balance. And this one on the left, he's actually making this sort of serpentine curve through this ice by melting down certain sections and then allowing the sun to melt that at a higher or faster speed than the rest. So you can imagine that once the sun sort of melts through this section all the way, you know, these structures might completely collapse. And that's why photography is a big part of his practice as well, photography and film. But I highly recommend you guys think more about that idea of kind of letting your materials partially decide this process for you. And I hope you bring that into your projects as well. All right. So these next works are by Trenton Doyle Hancock, and he's one of my very favorite artists. And he works across all sorts of media. He's a drawer, a painter, a comic book artist. He writes narrative. He creates sculpture, more performative sort of performance work. And all of his works sort of exist within one sort of world that he's built. And the idea of building worlds is kind of a contemporary idea that a lot of artists have been doing in order to sort of reimagine the world in a way that might be more inclusive and might be sort of telling a story through a different voice. And I really love his work for many reasons, but I think he's relevant for the idea of patterns in nature, because he seems to always be pulling inspiration from organic forms and then putting them into these surreal, maximal works of art and using them as a way of showing large worlds that have smaller worlds embedded within them. And I think this is just such an incredible idea. Here's another work of his. And they also remind me a bit of Hieronymus Bosch, one of the first surrealists to ever live, in that each one of these sort of entangled tree branches, there's also figures that feel like they're also a part of this larger pattern. They're all embedded within it. There's such deep space while also using some more graphic, almost like comic book style aesthetics. I highly recommend looking further into his work if you're interested in that sort of thing. All right, the next artist I want to show you is Kehinde Wiley, and he is just one of the most incredible artists that's alive right now, in my opinion. And you might know him from his very famous portrait of President Obama, which is in the National Portrait Gallery in DC, along with a lot of boring paintings of white presidents. And his work really investigates the idea of race and power through traditional European aesthetics and contemporary realism of taking portraits of people that he meets walking around his neighborhood. And he asks them how exactly they want to be represented. He then works with the person themselves, so there's a lot of consent involved, to form a narrative. And Kehinde is incredibly skilled in painting like a Renaissance painter. So he's able to take from the aesthetics of Renaissance and Baroque European styles and then use them to subvert the power structures that are evident in those works themselves. So historically, these images of conquistadors on horses were kind of like this way of representing power, colonial power. And so Kehinde Wiley uses these aesthetics in order to flip the script and tell a new story, and to also use them as a way of empowering Black people in his community.
So you can see in his work that he's using pattern as an aesthetic choice because it draws the viewer's eye in, but also because of the conceptual implications of these particular patterns. So many of these paintings are pulled from the history of art and design, and the history of painting in particular, which was and still can be an incredibly classist art form. So these were the aesthetics of oppressive colonialism, which he's then appropriating to make a statement about systemic racism and about the lack of representation historically. So he's making work about the conventions of art making and making us pay attention to the canon of art history. And he's also using these patterns and these aesthetics as a way of flipping the script and empowering people in his community. And this is a really contemporary, exciting idea that a lot of artists are employing these days, in which they're pulling from artistic traditions that they might not necessarily agree with conceptually, but using those aesthetics as a way of creating a narrative and referencing history in the process. So in this example, he's taking the art historical trope of the reclined figure and flipping the narrative. So here is Titian's Venus of Urbino. This is probably one of those images that Kehinde Wiley was looking at and referencing while making this work. You can almost see a direct line from these art historical poses into how he's depicting the figures and switching up the narratives in his work.
All right, so I wanted to show you guys some collagraphs. And a collagraph is a term that is used by many different artists who work in a lot of different ways. But these works were made by Antoni Tapias, and they were made by making stamps out of his hand, making stamps out of a wide variety of materials. And these prints are really kind of one of a kind, which almost makes them a monoprint or a monotype. But I just love how organic these textures are, and this fine line that outlines, it seems like there was ink pushed into the edges around a form, and then he used that to print it or run it through a press. All right, and here's a couple of monoprints by Bryce Winter and a monoprint by Anthony Benjamin. And one thing I love about these works is that you can really, especially in the one on the left here, you can really see the artist's hand in the work, where the energy of his marks is so evident. And so I really recommend, use some of those tools or some of these materials as a way of drawing or making your own marks. Even if you wanted to add some sort of narrative or representational aspect to it. This Anthony Benjamin work on the right, I think, is a fantastic example of allowing materials and the organic quality of materials to speak for themselves. So this beautiful purple print has the texture of something that you might find on accident, or something you might find on nature or in moss or in a tree, on tree bark. And he's allowing his materials to flow into these sort of tributaries and rivers throughout his composition that he never would have been able to achieve if he was just to draw it. So it's really about collaborating with the material and working with the textures, the organic, natural quality of what he's working with, and letting the materials speak for themselves. And the last thing I wanted to talk to you guys about is this idea of sacred geometry. So how these patterns found in nature are repeated in things that are very, very tiny to things that are much larger than us, like systems of weather. And I recommend doing a little bit of research into the golden ratio, or the Fibonacci sequence, or the Fibonacci spiral. And this is about the idea that there's this spiral, or this very specific mathematical set of angles that will create this spiral and this ratio that's beautiful to everyone who looks at it. And this has been used in the creation of the Great Pyramids in Egypt, to Da Vinci's work. Masters throughout history have used the golden ratio. And this is something we'll kind of come back to throughout the course. But I really recommend sort of thinking about how you can activate your composition within these sort of ratios. So maybe you want to take this spiral and draw it out on top of your holograph and compose within that spiral as sort of an exercise. But there's really so many ways you can approach this project. And I hope this presentation was hopefully inspiring or gave you some new ideas. But please don't feel like you're restricted within this project to make work that's non-objective or that's abstract, because you can absolutely embed ideas within this idea of texture and the collagraph process. So please, follow your creative process wherever it takes you, and don't be afraid to take some risks and, try to meditate on what it is that you're making after you make each print, or what it is that print might be saying to you and how you might want to push it in the next one. But I'm really excited to see how you approach this project, and I hope you have a great day.